I don't know if you've heard Gordon Rayner in for Kamal, who's on his hollybobs, but there is a 20 billion black hole in Britain's finances. Did you realise this? The money's missing.
I did hear that.
So I think we should discuss it and what it all means, and maybe even ask a Tory for their reaction to Rachel Reeves speaking today, saying that she's inherited the worst economic legacy since the Second World War. So we'll get stuck into that.
Yep. Meanwhile, in Toryland, Kemi Badenoch is in and Suella Braverman is out. Kemi's the favourite, but will Suella go over to Reform?
Braverman's blown up. We'll be discussing that. And the Olympics, it's the talk of the town, Gordon. And I don't mean Paris. I mean here in London, in Great Britain, because we've just won a gold.
We have.
Which is exciting in the 3-day eventing. And we've won a couple of great silvers. But most importantly, the greatest sportsman of my generation, I'm going to call him this, Andy Murray, is through to the second round of the doubles tennis.
Except he's not.
Well, he kind of is.
Except he's not.
All right, we'll discuss that in a moment. Welcome to the Daily Tea with me, Camilla Tominey.
And me, Gordon Rayner.
It's the Chancellor's big speech. It's not a budget, Gordon, but
No.
it's Rachel Reeves setting out why we don't have any money left and why we can't spend any of it because we don't have it on infrastructure that hasn't even been built yet.
Or do we not have any money? Or maybe we do have some money.
We'll try and find out if we have any money.
Yeah.
Shall we listen to what she had to say this afternoon?
Yep.
It means, Mr. Speaker, that we have inherited a projected overspend of £22 billion. A £22 billion hole in the public finances now. Yeah. Not in the future, but now. £22 billion of spending this year that was covered up by the party opposite. Yeah. If left unaddressed, it would mean a 25% increase in the budget deficit this year. So I will today set out the necessary and urgent work that I have already done to reduce that pressure on the public finances by £5.5 billion this year and over £8 billion next year. Let me be clear. I'm not talking about costs for future years that they signed up to but did not include, like the compensation for infected blood, which has cross-party support. I'm not talking about the state of public services in the future, like the crisis in our prisons, which they have left for us to fix. I'm talking about the money that they were already spending this year and had no ability to pay for, which they hid from the country. They had exhausted the reserve, and they knew that, but nobody else did. Yet they ducked the difficult decisions. They put party before country.
So that sort of, if we can't afford it, we can't do it. People up and down the country will understand that. When household budgets are stretched, families have to make difficult choices, Gordon. Do you know who this is reminding me of?
Are you going to say Margaret Thatcher?
Yes, it's slightly Thatch-like, isn't it? It's like, oh, I'm a greengrocer's daughter. I know how to manage family budgets, and we can't. Why is she channeling her inner Thatcher? What's happened to politics?
It's kind of turned upside down, hasn't it? We've got this weird situation now where you've got a Labour government coming in and literally saying the Tories have spent too much money. They've squandered money on this, that and the other. They've just spent money willy-nilly. And now we need to come in as Labour and we need to relay the foundations. We need to start being more austere. It feels like another era of austerity.
Can't mention the A word if you're Labour, though.
No.
What can they call it instead?
Fiscal competence.
Yes. That's it.
And so they're talking about scrapping lots of schemes. They're talking about scrapping the railway lines, the beaching lines that were going to be reopened. They're talking about scrapping that Stonehenge tunnel that we've heard so much about over the past few years.
Crusties are delighted with that, though,
Yes,
let's be honest. It's
they
a good little boon for the Green vote.
Quite. They're talking about delaying those 40 hospitals that Boris originally promised. They're talking about the Arundel bypass, which the A27, which again probably will go down well with Green campaigners.
And pothole people, because they're going to fill potholes with that money instead.
Supposedly.
Very economically, intelligent.
Although the potholes will come back.
They always come back because they're not filled with the right stuff, I think we all know. What's happened to proper tarmac?
Well,
it's a discussion for another podcast. I mean, I thought the point of Labour was that they did splash the cash on all this big stuff. I appreciate probably the A27 Arundel bypass isn't everyone's priority, and neither is the tunnel under the A303. I mean, unless you happen to be those people that are constantly travelling to their second homes in Cornwall and Devon.
Or you live in Arundel.
And you care. But isn't she in such a difficult position because she's saying there's no money left, but I'm not going to tax working people anymore because that wouldn't win us elections. And I'm not going to borrow in a Corbynista way because we're fiscally very disciplined. And I can't really cut any government departments because we don't like the austerity era of Osborne and Cameron.
Yeah.
Therefore, all I've got left in the kit bag, beyond stealth taxes I might introduce in the autumn statement, is we'll cancel stuff we haven't done yet.
Well, only a few days ago, everything was going to be about growth, wasn't it? It was that's as we've discussed, or as you've discussed before on the podcast. Keir Starmer came in. He said, "Here's what we're going to do. We're going to have growth, which is what everybody says when they come into government, and it's all going to be done by relaxing the planning laws. So we're going to build. But the problem with that is that if that is how you're going to stimulate growth, surely you need things like railway lines going to places where people might want to live and get into work. You will need things like a bypass, for that part of the country. You will need new hospitals because if you're growing the economy, you're going to, obviously we've got population growth as well. So it's pretty counterintuitive to say that we're going to grow the economy by building loads of houses, but by the way, we're going to scrap all the infrastructure that would have supported, presumably, a lot of those houses.
I can see Andrew Griffith, who formerly has worked at the Treasury. He is now the Shadow Secretary of State for Science, Innovation and Technology. While he comes in, I'm going to read some of this polling data because it's pretty dire for the Conservatives. Hello, Andrew. Take a seat. This YouGov poll, I think, is kind of disastrous just for the Conservative legacy that we're going to discuss in just a second. Only 1 in 10 Britons believe that the economy is in a good state. 1 in 10. Nearly 2/3 of Britons, so that's 64%, think that the economy is in a bad state. Over half, 55%, say they have had to cut their spending since the start of the cost of living crisis. Having said all that, the public are currently at their most optimistic about the economy that they have been in 2 years, which does call into question Rishi Sunak's timing on calling the election. Andrew, first of all, welcome to the Daily Tea, fresh from Victoria Station next door. Perfect timing for you to discuss whether there is or isn't any money left. Now, you were Economic Secretary to the Treasury under Rishi Sunak, Financial Secretary to the Treasury under Liz Truss. There's apparently no money left, and it's all the Tories' fault.
Well, in those famous words of Christine Keeler, they would say that, wouldn't they? Look, the reality is that the state this year will spend about £1 trillion, so 20 billion is less than 2% of that, and you can always make choices. What we're hearing today is the worst case on overspends, but not banking any benefit from underspends. Like us all, we're relatively early in the government's accounting year, so inevitably there'll be some cost pressures, but there'll also be some things where government just doesn't get money out the door as it thinks. We're seeing significant funded wage increases, public sector wage increases, not those that your listeners are going to have, but those that are lucky enough to work in the public sector, well above that 2% rate of inflation. So that wasn't budgeted for because we would have made tough choices or asked for productivity benefits in return for those above inflation wage rises.
So that's a choice rather than a black hole.
So that's a choice. And there's other choices that government can make in terms of things like the cost of the immigration and welfare budgets. There are always choices to be made, even within a fiscal year. And of course, there's the big choice, which is how much government chooses to spend on itself. Now, if you start from the view that 100% of government spending is perfectly optimised, there's no room for waste, none of these diversity officers could ever be reduced, then of course you're going to find black holes. So what this is a political exercise. It's designed to front run what we think Labour always wanted to do, which is to put up taxes, but they're also cutting back infrastructure. So in my own constituency and people across West Sussex, a much needed bypass that's been under potential development since Labour last cancelled it, is now going to consign motorists to congestion, to communities for pollution and rat running for another generation. So there's lots of choices that government can make. This government has coming into power. They're not making the really hard choices that your readers would want, but what they are doing is a pre-baked agenda.
Can I just ask, we were talking about the things that they're cutting, and we mentioned the Arundel bypass. Why is that so hard to say?
I don't know.
Arundel.
Arundel.
The Arundel bypass. Presumably that bypass would have stimulated economic growth, would it? Have there been any costings done for how much it would have benefited the local economy?
Well, it's a real, at the moment, the congestion, and it affects anyone really travelling from Chichester to Brighton, so it's across the whole of really the south coast. It's holding businesses back. We have a fantastic local business, Rolls-Royce, mostly export, but it's holding back that business, its workers. And of course, we've had an enormous amount of housing development in common with most of the southeast of England.
Yeah.
So improving that infrastructure is really just catch up. And now we're faced with the prospect of Angela Rayner saying that she's going to concrete over even more parts of the southeast. This is precisely the sort of infrastructure that would make that level of development either more palatable or more acceptable to local communities. So there's a real contradiction going on here.
Yeah.
Having said that, you were in the Treasury kind of on and off for the last, 2, 3, 4 years. And unfortunately, whether you've intended to do it or not, the Tories have trashed their own reputation for economic competence. Like those YouGov figures I read out are awful. The economy might be doing much better than the public think. And ultimately, yes, that's because Rachel Reeves is presenting them with a scaremongering sort of worst case scenario. But it's also because you've squandered trust in yourselves on managing the country's finances.
No, look, there's no getting away from that. Trust and competence are one of the reasons why we saw in particular a lot of Conservative voters stay at home. Some vote for other parties, both on the left or the right. And that's a critical part of how we earn the right to be reconsidered. Part of that is providing good opposition, which is what we've been doing today, calling out where Labour have effectively manufactured a £20 billion claimed black hole to do things that they wanted to do anyway. Partly that's about how we move forward, conduct ourselves maturely through a leadership election that isn't overly divisive, but also take the time over the next few months to find that right leader who can help us renew and rebuild and get back. So, you were kind enough to acknowledge the economy is better than people think. It's the fastest growing economy in the G7. Inflation is now back to its 2% level from having been 11%. But of course, I understand that. There's been a very difficult period for people since COVID. Costs have increased. There is pressure on the public first from the decisions that were taken. So, of course, that you never disagree with people in terms of how they feel and how they perceive the situation. You also know, as do most leading economists, that the economy now is in a reasonable shape compared with most other Western European economies. It's a shame politically that this government will reap some of the benefit of that. In particular, when it comes to the public finances, there will be a lot of benefit from the falling cost of government borrowing. It's one of the really big costs. We spend more on government borrowing now than we do on defence or on schools. As interest rates fall, following the inflation reduction, that's going to give Rachel Reeves a positive tailwind. But you won't be hearing anything about that from the government between now and the budget. What they'll be doing is rolling the pitch for taxes.
Why do you think the Tories have been so bad, though, at getting across the point that things like employment figures have been fantastic? I don't think that people really talk about that enough, and it's something which was a very strong suit for the Tories, and yet it seems to have been squandered. Why was that, do you think?
Well, look, I don't think myself or Jeremy Hunt, when he was Chancellor, were ever abashed about talking in a balanced way what's going well as some of the challenges, particularly on the overall level of government borrowing because of the cost of COVID. Look, I think ultimately it's the point that Camilla said, that we're in a position where eventually the electorate stop listening to us. And so the sort of calm conversation we can have about economic statistics, which sounds dry to many people as well, but it is really, really important when you look at the public finances, the amount that we've all got as a nation to spend on things that we want, public services, roads, infrastructure, things that make people's lives day to day better, that eventually people tuned out. That's part of the big road of renewal from here.
Does it surprise you that Rachel Reeves is going down this route of cancelling infrastructure projects? He talked a bit, obviously, about Arundel and the idea that if you're going to have growth, if you're going to build houses, you need that infrastructure. Are you quite surprised that they're going down that route? Because that's not very Labour, is it?
I'm not surprised in my particular case, because it's something that they did actually say before the election, and so people were warned that they'd have this impact on the A27. I do think it's incredibly short-sighted. There's a real point about how you run your public finances. Capital investment, things like investing in roads, bypasses, even hospital building programmes, they're for the long term. And you don't raid the long term to plug a hole, even if you've made that hole yourself with higher than inflation pay rises. You don't raid the long-term infrastructure to plug a hole in your current year accounts. And I think anyone, I was finance director for 15 years, anyone in that sort of domain, I'm sure most of the fiscal institutes as well would agree with that. If you've got an issue today, you solve that by making tough choices. We would have made tough choices. Our manifesto had £12 billion of welfare reform. None of that would have been easy. Right? Those are not easy decisions that any politician wants to make, but that actually is what your job is to do. If you are the Chancellor of the UK Exchequer, I'm afraid you do have to make those tough choices. You can't just come on in against figures that were known by the OBR, clutch your forehead and say, oh, isn't this terrible? Because as a politician, you should be in the job of making those tough choices.
So are you saying she absolutely knew all of the figures when she came into office?
Well, they're either a consequence of figures that were known. So the OBR published very rigorously, much, much more transparently than any business or your own personal finances. So they were knowable. And secondly, they've made some of them worse. So to the extent there's always headwinds, and at the start of a financial year, there's headwinds and tailwinds in terms of things that will be underspent. But when you've taken public sector pay settlements and not extracted any productivity improvements in return to help fund those, you've made your own job harder. Okay, and there's other things like giving Ed Miliband £8 billion to play with GB Energy, the world's most expensive summer job in history. There was nothing that said they needed to do that. That is a choice that they've made. So you've coming in, first few weeks, what are the choices they're making? They're giving Ed Miliband money to play with net zero, and they are funding their trade union bosses by giving significantly above inflation pay rises to the public sector. So to the extent there's a hole at all, it's a hole of their own creation. And if there are tough choices to be made, why are they not making tough choices in those particular domains rather than cancelling infrastructure projects and hospital building programmes up and down the country?
Andrew, do you mind staying with us? Because we want to discuss the Tory leadership. You've mentioned it. Before we do that, can I just ask you one question? Because she is coming into the Daily Tea studio tomorrow, Liz Truss, because she's going to be saying things about the Bank of England and her own economic legacy. You worked with her very closely. Does she need to take the rap for the failure of Trussonomics? Is she showing enough contrition?
Oh, look, I'm not in the business. Politics is not my world. I was in business for 27 years. I'm not in the business of advising people on their own personal brand development. Look, I think there are a lot of things that your listeners and viewers will agree with in terms of what Liz was saying about the need for growth, which actually is exactly what Rachel Reeves is saying, that you can't run an economy unless you can focus on growth. The need for supply-side reform. I think Liz and Conservatives generally have talked and delivered a better game on that than we're seeing the government so far, but let's see. And the third thing is the importance of having sound money. Now, those are general Conservative principles. Now, clearly, I don't follow these things overly closely, but there were challenges in the execution. And
yes,
that could be a massive understatement. I understand that, but we saw rates rise across the Western world, and we should properly look at, how was it that government was able to have the right advice, the role of the Bank of England, the best economists at the time, and that sort of thing. So,
fair enough.
I don't know if that answers your question fairly,
no,
but I try and be balanced, and there'll be some good things that your listeners will support, and some impacts that have damaged our party as well.
Now, nominations for the Tory leadership contest closed at 2:30 p.m. Here's Bob Blackman, the chairman of the 1922 committee, announcing who those people are going to be.
As the returning officer for the 1922 committee and for the Conservative Party, the close of nominations, which took place at 2:30 today, I've received the following 6 valid nominations. And I'll read the candidates and the proposer and seconder. Kemi Badenoch, proposed by Alex Burkhart, seconded by Julia Lopez. James Cleverly, proposed by Gagan Mahindra and seconded by Peter Fortune. Robert Jenrick, proposed by Danny Kruger and seconded by Caroline Johnson. Priti Patel, nominated by Greg Smith and seconded by Saki Bhatti. Mel Stride, proposed by Jeremy Mayhew and seconded by David Reed. Tom Tugendhat, proposed by Karen Bradley and seconded by Neil Shastri Hurst. Those 6 candidates will now be free to campaign, to appear on the media, to go to associations, do events all over the country as they wish.
So, Gordon, before the weekend, at the last count, I think we had 4 men who had thrown their hats into the ring.
We did.
We had James Cleverly, who was first out of the blocks. Then we had Tom Tugendhat, did we? Or did we have Jenrick first?
We had Jenrick. I think he was maybe the first. I can't remember.
No, it was Cleverly, Jenrick. It doesn't really matter. Tugendhat.
No. Yes.
Then we had Mel Stride.
Yes.
It was almost like there's a race going on. There's another horse. They've been cut loose.
Yep.
Then they've joined the race. But we had no women in the race. Only rumours of women.
Yep.
And then buses too have come along at the same time. Then we had Priti Patel declare her candidacy in an op-ed for the Telegraph. There's a theme here, Gordon, because we are getting most of the declarations except Kemi Badenoch today, who did go to a rival that we won't mention. But we'll get onto that in just a minute. Now, Andrew Griffith, as you're here and a Tory and you're subject to all of the gossip in the tea room, what's the chat? What do we think at this stage of these candidates?
Well, I think we've got a good field is the first point. I think that you can see there's a balanced level of support coming out across the party. As you say, we've got different sexes, different generations, I think, within that, different temperaments and styles. So the most important thing in a contest is you have a proper choice. And I think the party, because ultimately this will be for the members across the country, those that have been doing the heavy lifting during the recent election campaigns, and most of whom, remember now, very sadly, do not have a Conservative Member of Parliament to represent them. Most of them are sitting there in opposition-held seats. So ultimately they will have that final choice. But a good range and a good choice, and we start the process of, I don't know how long it's 3 months, is it? We start the process. We start the process of a debate. No, I don't think it's too long. I was always a longie, if you like, on the basis that sadly we've got the luxury now of time in opposition, and so we've got to use that wisely. And there is no more important decision than the Conservative Party membership and MPs are going to have to make than choosing the leader that's going to take us back to an election in 2028 or 2029.
Is it definitely
we can't afford to get that decision wrong, so it's right that we take our time.
But is it definitely that? Are you choosing a leader of the opposition for now, or are you also choosing a potential future PM?
Well, everyone will decide that in their own way, but I'm choosing a potential future Prime Minister of this country. The number one job of the Conservative Party is to elect a government. My sincere hope is that we're able to do that in 2028. We've just seen a government elected on only 34.5% of popular support, so 2/3 even of those that voted did not vote for this government. And we discussed some of the reasons off the back of COVID and the difficulties over the past few years. So I'm in the business of looking at all of the leaders through the lens set of who could both lead us on that journey, but also take us back into power and be a future Prime Minister.
So were you surprised that Suella Braverman didn't stand? We thought there may have been 3 women standing, maybe even 4. She's pulled out. Was that a surprise to you?
Look, I think it's been emerging over the last few days and weeks. So ultimately, I wasn't surprised. But clearly, if we all wind the clock back a few weeks or months, then she would have been one of the names in the consideration set. As I say, I think if...
Why not surprised, though? Because you feel like most people, she's kind of blown herself up by being too outspoken.
Oh, no, I've just been reading my Telegraph diligently.
Well, good man. That's what we like to hear.
You've been talking about that story.
But has she been too reformish? This idea that you have to out Farage. People have concluded you can't really do that, so Braverman served her purpose.
Oh, that it was so simple that there was a single sort of silver bullet that could be fired. I mean, the reality is that I think I saw statistics today saying 2.5 million people who voted Conservative in 2019 actually stayed on their sofa. right? So
exactly
the importance of appealing to people who stayed on their sofa and didn't vote for the Lib Dems or Reform is as important. So it's not about a silver bullet. It's why we need, and we've got now a fairly long contest to go through and make sure we make a wise decision. We've got a good range of candidates within that. And we've got candidates within that, like Kemi, who are talking explicitly about the need for renewal. And I'm very much of that. Look, we need renewal. It's not about just go away, lick our wounds for a few weeks, and then one big push gets us back. I think this is a moment where we have got the opportunity and the necessity for profound renewal.
It sounds as if you haven't decided yet who you're going to back.
Well, right? I hope that when I do, the Telegraph readers will be the first to know.
Good.
So,
you have to tell. We have a spreadsheet running here, but it sounds like you're leaning into Kemi a bit there.
I haven't declared exactly, but I do think she's one of the more. I do think she's full disclosure, I think she's one of the more interesting candidates. I, like everybody, want to hear a little bit more. It's been a busy last 12 hours, and I know she's been writing and speaking to people. But I think she's one of the more interesting candidates within that.
For sure. And you say you need to hear a little bit more. What is it you need to hear from her or somebody else for them to get your vote?
Look, I think it's about three things. I think it's about, what are the lessons of our defeat? I'm not someone who naturally, you have to have an optimistic bias to be in politics at all. So I don't think it's overly mawkish looking backwards. But we do have to make sure we learn the right lessons. That point about not just knee-jerking into thinking it's just about reform, for example, is an important lesson to learn. The second is we need to hear a plan for opposition. Right? How do we conduct ourselves in opposition? How are we going to mobilise all of the talents we've got in a fairly limited now talent pool of 121 colleagues? Whoever leads us, and I will support whoever leads us loyally, we need to work really well together because we've got a much reduced parliamentary presence. But then the third thing is, how do you frame a policy offering that is relevant for where we'll be in 28 or 2029? And so that's a challenge. Again, I'm not going to answer that myself here and now, but I think that's an important part of the debate that we now have.
Before we let you go, just give us a little insight into how it works with MPs and the need to gain your support. Over the weekend or over recent days, are you being phoned up by all of the candidates? Sort of, oh, Andrew, I loved what you did at the Treasury. Come with me. Is it that kind of is it like dating or something? Speed dating.
There's probably a little element of that, but let's be clear. We do all, and no, I'm not as green as I was 5 years ago, having served a full length of Parliament and served in government with almost all of, if not all of the colleagues who are standing, all of whom are colleagues and command my support and respect. So, there is a bit of, look, should we have a chat and how are you thinking, and have you got any particular leanings and indications? And I'm a straight dealer as well, and I'll try and talk to people about what it is that I'm feeling about how things should proceed.
But do the candidates phone you personally? Is it better if they phone you for actual FaceTime rather than putting their people onto you?
Look, we're a pretty small group now,
yes.
And as I say, I sit in the shadow cabinet. Again, quite a small group of us, but I sit there alongside many of the colleagues who are standing. And it's really important, and I hope you'll hear this from everybody, that ultimately, whoever is elected, we all need to work together. And I'd be very happy to work with any of those names that have put themselves forward, because that's the only chance we've got. It's a very narrow precipice to get ourselves back that we've got to walk along. It's our only chance to do that.
Thank you very much, Andrew.
Thank you for coming in. Lovely to see you. Gordon, now that Andrew Griffith has left, I think he's going to support Kemi, don't you?
I got that vibe. I don't know why. I just, there was definitely a sort of, yes, he's definitely going to support her.
Going to support her. Yeah. Shall we talk through the pros and cons of Priti Patel versus Kemi Badenoch, as they're the only two women left in the race?
Yeah.
Which I find a little disappointing. I'd have liked to have seen more birds represented in the Tory fray.
And we could end up with none. I
Do you fear that?
I think it could be.
Well, let's just discuss Priti, because we were discussing her earlier. We both know her pretty well.
Mm-hmm.
You know that infamous video where she's dancing with Nigel Farage? I was at that party. Were you?
I think I might have been.
Yeah, we were at the karaoke party. Point is about that video, although it came to be a sort of hate video among the left, it shows the real her, because her reputation isn't quite what her personality is like.
No, she has become this sort of hate figure, as you say, for the left. And but the truth is, she's actually she's very warm, very friendly. She's good fun. Anyone who spends time in her company will always come away, feeling positive towards her. I think that's fair.
I mean, she likes a laugh. She likes a little gossip. She's quite mischievous.
Very, yeah.
And actually, to her credit, you would be hard-pressed to find another Tory MP that sort of cares about conservatism more. She's got the party sort of like running through her veins.
Yeah.
She's been a member since she was a teenager, I think. She's spent a whole career knocking on doors.
Yeah.
She loves the whole grassroots sort of conservative scene. She's a genuinely committed Tory.
Yeah, and she spent time campaigning way back when Hague was leader, for example. So she has experience of what it's like to be in opposition and how tough that is. So she knows what she'd be letting herself in for if she did get the job. And she, as you say, she's a bit of a darling of the grassroots. She does have that experience. We're going through the pros here now.
Yes.
She has that experience.
Although some might say she's a bit past it and a bit old hat.
I think that probably there are two things that are the biggest problems for her. One is that inevitably the other candidates, particularly people like Kemi Badenoch, will say she's the past and you need to be looking to the future. I think the other thing which we've already seen people attacking her for is that her being, as they put it, the architect of the points-based immigration system, which they then say that's failed. The reason that we've got such high net migration numbers is because of that, and that's on her. That's what they say.
So it's your fault for not running the... Although
we'll hear that a lot.
I think that's quite... If you speak to people who aren't necessarily ideologically wedded to her, like, for instance, Sir Robert Buckland, who was Justice Secretary while she was Home Secretary, he says that out of Theresa May, her and Suella Braverman, she was by far the best Home Secretary. She didn't do silly things like May, like cut the police. And she didn't do what some people accuse Braverman of, which is not enough at the Home Office on anything.
Yeah.
And she was good on terror and all those things.
All I'm saying is that is what you're going to hear from her opponents. They will try and put that on her, and perception is reality in these things. And if they can get people to perceive that she's to blame for it, then that's their aim, isn't it?
The other clever thing she's done is she now seems more moderate because she's kept her head down.
Yeah.
She hasn't briefed against anybody. She hasn't written incendiary opinion pieces in the Telegraph saying the Tories are all rubbish. And
like Suella did.
Exactly. I'd prefer to work with Nigel Farage.
Yeah.
Do we think Suella's going to defect to Reform, by the way? I think Lee Anderson has told us today that she'd be more than welcome in the party.
Yeah, I think that the feeling is that if anyone's going to, it'll be her.
Yes.
Or that if there are going to be a number of Tory MPs, she would be the first one in the vanguard. But I do think it depends on who wins this contest. If it's somebody that she feels she can get behind, she won't do that. If it's somebody very centrist, let's say Tom Tugendhat or James Cleverly, well, I don't know, maybe she could.
By the way, do we think it's a blessing or a curse that Boris Johnson has said he's not backing anyone? Because, to be fair, I was having a chat with some of Pretty's people last week, and they were mentioning the BJ factor and saying, well, if she's got the weight of Boris behind her, that could help. And then he's done that typical thing of being completely unreliable.
Yeah.
Even, he used to be going on during every moment. He would go, stick with Prit. We love Pretty. They're really close. And now he's just going to sit on the fence, is he?
They are really close. There was some quite Boris-y language, actually, in the piece that she wrote for us, announcing her candidacy, although they insisted he didn't have anything to do with writing it. But I think you can overplay this idea that if you are friends with Boris, then you've got the party on your side. Because if you remember, there was a poll done a little while ago, after Partygate, I think. 2/3 of Tory members, I think, said they would rather Boris was not, didn't want him to return as Tory leader. That rather suggests that you're only getting 1/3 of the members backing, and 2/3 might be put off by that. So
although
I don't know that it's a slam dunk.
If you look at YouGov, he remains the most popular Conservative politician in the country.
Well,
Tony Blair remains the least popular Labour politician in the country. I just want to get that out there because Kamal isn't here, and therefore I'm allowed to slag off Tony Blair in his absence. Shall we look at Kemi then? What do you make of Kemi on a personal level?
Well, I have seen Kemi. I haven't had a huge amount of personal interaction with Kemi, but I've spoken to her. But I've seen her several times when she's been appearing at conferences. In particular, she does get a tremendous reception from the party members. They literally shout out, "We love you, Kemi." It's almost like a sort of American style rally, when she speaks. I do think that she is very. She's very good. She's a very good public speaker. She does have an X factor. And rather like as we've said with Priti, she does have a huge backing from the membership, I think. And I think that if she were to get to the final two, she probably will win. But she does need to get to the final two. And I think that's the hurdle that she needs to be worrying about at the moment, because MPs may or may not decide to put her there. Yeah,
so the MP thing we'll get onto in a minute, just to say how popular she is with the so-called grassroots. So if we look at the Conservative Home poll, this month puts her well ahead. She's on 26% of the vote, and Jenrick and Tugendhat are both tied on 13. So she's got double the support of those two, Cleverly on 9, Priti on 3. And then in our own Telegraph poll, which we keep on updating all the time, so do have a look at the website if you want to vote, Kemi's on 37%, Jenrick's next on 18, Tugendhat on 16, Cleverly 12, Patel 13, Mel Stride 4.
Oh, poor old Mel.
But we're going to find out more about Mel Stride because we hope to have him in the Daily Tea this week, so stay tuned for that. The other thing is, when we did the pros and cons, some of the pros are also cons. It's funny, isn't it?
Yeah. When we were talking about this, we said, well, she's the front runner. That seems like a big positive. But also, we know from history, especially with Tory leadership contests, the front runner very often doesn't get it.
Falls at the first hurdle.
Well, they very often, there's somebody comes up, on the rails.
Brings up the rear, Mel Stride.
John Major did
before you know it.
Yeah. So in some respects, being the front runner is a precarious position to be in, right?
I like it how we put pros and cons, and we just put fighter in both categories.
We did.
She takes the fight to Labour. She loves a scrap. She's courageous. She's sort of like, wears her heart on her sleeve. You can tell if she is annoyed because she will tell everybody who wants to hear it at the dispatch box. However,
she also takes the fight to Tory MPs, which is not great.
Does she use a giant sledgehammer to crack a nut?
Yeah, I think, look, what I keep hearing from people and I'm sure you're the same. When you talk to people in Parliament, there's always a sort of, Kemi would be good, but there's always a but. And the but tends to be, but she's very angry all the time. She picks fights all the time. We know, obviously, there was that moment when there was the shadow cabinet meeting after the election when, she reportedly sort of stood up and had a massive go at Rishi Sunak, talked about, Suella having a nervous breakdown. That went down incredibly badly.
Good for copy.
Incredibly badly. And so I think the problem that she's got is that MPs know her very well. A lot of them have probably had run-ins with her or know somebody who's had a run-in with her, and that's why what I mean about she has to get to the final two, and the MPs might decide they don't want her in the final two. There may be a Stop Kemi, movement going on.
The other, so we said a pro was that she's got a good backstory, growing up in Nigeria, come to Britain in very much in the vein of Rishi Sunak, sort of somebody that can speak about her pride in being adopted by Britain and being aspirational because of Britain and a child of Thatcher and all the rest of it. Reminded Angela Rayner the other day that she too was a child of Thatcher, which was a good line. Having said that, she could be a bit schoolmarmish. Did I tell you what happened at the Spectator Party where I bowled over... My God. So Andrew Roberts, the historian, was there, sort of entered into a chat because he's a very intelligent man, writes for the paper, writes for everyone. So I was like, how can the Conservatives fix themselves? Got into that. He's standing with this other chap who I felt like I recognised. So I was like, OK, we're all having a chat. I turn to Andrew, I say, who's the answer? Who can unite the right? He looks at me sort of astonished. Well, Kemi, of course. I turn to the other chap and I go, do you agree with that analysis? He goes, I really better should because she's my wife. It was Mr. Badenoch I'd met him, but I'd got some face blindness going on.
Oh dear.
Thank God I hadn't stormed into the conversation and started slagging her.
No,
off,
and I hope you
which
didn't
I wouldn't do.
And I hope you didn't say Badenoch instead of Badenoch either.
I said Badenoch.
Good.
Yes, because I know how to pronounce her name.
Thank goodness for that.
How do you pronounce the candidate Tom something's name?
Tom Tugendhat.
No,
No?
it's Tugendhat.
Oh, no.
And I got that from the horse's mouth.
Not for me, it's not. I'm sorry. It's
well,
not.
he's told me that's how.
Yeah, but if he doesn't know how to pronounce his own name, that's not my fault, is it?
Shall we look at some of... I tell you what, you were going to read out a lovely clip that you found from... A lovely snippet, rather, that you found from Lord Ashcroft's new biography of Kemi.
So he's brought out a book about a biography of Kemi Badenoch.
It's just Badenoch.
Badenoch.
It sounds like it should be with the in the middle because it's Scottish, but again, it's from the horse's mouth.
Fine. Okay, we'll go with that. Anyway, so he's brought out a book about her, which, with great timing, which may be a bestseller if she gets the job, or it may have a very short shelf life if she doesn't. Anyway, there is a very interesting anecdote in there. He was talking to somebody who is a friend of hers who knows her very well, and this is what they said. She's humorous, but she can also become quite passionate, and that passion can become anger. She'd need to work on that. I think in future, she could either save the country or she could self-destruct. Either outcome is equally likely.
Right. Okay. So she's a bit of a risk. Why do you say you don't think she'll be in the final two?
Well, because I'm not saying she won't be. But I do think that it feels as though she's the candidate that is most likely to be the victim of people ganging up against her.
Yes.
That she might do well in the first ballot, but then people who get knocked out may start to weigh in behind someone else who's not Kemi in order to stop Kemi, just because that's the vibe that I'm sort of getting a little bit when I talk to
Also, the left
MPs.
and the left-wing newspapers are out to get her, and there's talk of a dodgy dossier being circulated, and she's addressed that with us and said, people are trying to bring me down, all the rest of it. For what it's worth, Telegraph readers, Alp owner? No, that's not a fake name. Alp owner, fine. I think Kemi Badenoch is great. She grew up under a socialist military dictatorship. She appreciates the UK and openly speaks about how the Conservative values gave her everything. She can deal with woke Labour identity politics as well. But then A. McGrath says simply, Kemi Badenoch is an argumentative individual who will divide, not unite.
But then we've got Warren Sheehy, who says, I've been saying this for a couple of weeks now, not that it makes me right, but if the new Tory leader served in the cabinet of Sunak, then clearly the message has not sunk in.
Add the last bit.
And then he says vote reform. So I think we kind of know.
Okay, so Nigel Farage for Tory leader. That's brilliant. G-Ray, you and I had the most glorious year of our careers in 2012 when we were both posted to cover the London Olympics.
Yeah.
You and I were hanging out, weren't we, at the track. We were in that weird thing where the athletes came through and we were there with our notebooks going.
And in the middle of the velodrome.
So good.
In the middle of the velodrome with the whizzing around us. That was incredible.
We kept on going up to each other, didn't we, going, I can't believe we're being paid for this.
It was great.
It was great. Now, I posted on X, always a mistake, last week, that I thought that Andy Murray was the greatest sportsman of my generation. Can we just be reminded of his greatness in this amazing comeback in the doubles on Sunday night with Dan Evans? Even he was amazed. They came back in the tiebreak. It was 9-4. They basically got 6 successive points to win that game. God knows how. Let's listen to the great Scotsman's reaction to his own triumph.
I mean, in the moment, like when we finished the match, both of us just laughing. Haven't celebrated a match win like that since maybe the Kokonakis match in Australia. But yeah, what an amazing feeling, like to get through that. There's just a bit of shock, genuine like happiness at the end of it. And yeah, glad I came.
He's glad he came.
I love that.
Good old Andy.
Am I wrong?
It's a matter of opinion, obviously. I would argue that he's not the greatest athlete of your generation or mine. I would say that, he's a tennis player who, like all tennis players, he gets 4 chances a year to win a Grand Slam, which is what ultimately we judge them on, and obviously other competitions in between. He won 3 in his career over the course of quite a long career. And also he gets paid an enormous amount of money, and he gets a huge amount of coverage, so he's got a lot of things in his favour. I would argue that someone like Sir Chris Hoy would be more deserving of that accolade, because...
But then maybe you're saying, I didn't say greatest Olympian.
No.
I don't think that's right.
No. But I'm arguing athlete.
Yes.
Because...
I said sportsman, but I take your point. Okay.
Well, even more so then, because Hoy... he's a guy who, again, if we judge him on the big things, in which case we're talking Olympics and World Championships, he only really got a chance to shine in the sort of, on a national level once every 4 years.
Yes.
It's a very long time to have to dedicate yourself to something when nobody's really paying much attention to you, and not getting paid a huge amount of money either while he's doing it. He won 6 gold medals at the Olympics and 1 silver across 4 Olympics. Amazing achievement.
Yeah, that's good longevity.
And if we're talking about sportsmanship, here's somebody who one of my abiding memories of 2012 was standing in the velodrome, seeing him win that record 6th gold medal. It was an incredible race. There was a German guy called Maximilian Levy who actually got past him on the final turn. It looked like he'd lost, and then Hoy found some extra willpower just to get over the line, won, the place erupted. It was incredible. And then afterwards, he did a press conference, as they all do, and I hadn't really got a chance to ask a question. So I decided, as he was walking out of the press conference, I sort of sidled up to him and said, "Oh, do you mind if I ask you another question, Chris?" He was being pulled out to go and do his drugs test, as all medalists have to do. And he was like, "Sure, yeah, whatever you want." And I walked along to the drugs room with him, chatting, asking questions, taking notes. He'd never met me before. He didn't know who I was. Gave me so much time that in the end they were literally pulling his arm to drag him into the drug testing room.
You've done that thing of having you've got to it's not just a man crush, it's a little journo crush. We have this when people surprise us by being nice.
And he's such a nice man. And if you ask anybody who's ever dealt with him, they'll all have a similar story. I talked to other people who dealt with him. They had talked about times when they'd done an interview, they were given an hour, and he ended up talking for 2 or 3 hours, or they spent 2 or 3 hours with him because he was so generous with his time. You can't say that about all sportsmen, as you know. Not naming any names, but there are some British idols who would not give you the time of day when they're off camera. So
I love that you're not naming any names.
Well, I think we know.
There was a couple of Olympians, or at least one, that was a bit unhappy about his medal haul being overtaken by Chris Hoy.
Yeah, and this is not the name that I was thinking of, but yes, Steve Redgrave was in the velodrome and saw Chris Hoy overtaking his all-time record. He wasn't the happiest person in the whole velodrome.
Bad luck. That's sport for you, isn't it, Gordon?